Well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. It might be a pretty thin crowd this morning, all the storms last night. Maybe they'll come in a little bit late, but we'll get started. And before I forget, I won't be here next week. Gonna go to visit the church we support in Haiti, and so I won't be here next Sunday. And y'all may need to run over and gang up on them in 123 and give them what for, you know. So a praise and prayer this morning. Certainly, I really am not aware of what all happened last night. Our power was out, and so we didn't know. Hope y'all don't know of any destruction, no homes destroyed, nothing. Okay, good deal. Took. I was telling Brandon, it took some pretty big trees down over by our house, but took some transformers out, but. Write that down. Anybody have anything else? I guess obviously we have the election this week. We'll be praying for, as Joseph often says, for our nation and for our churches in the middle of that. Anybody have anything else?
Praise the Lord that Gina's got to be with us this weekend.
Oh yeah, it's pretty sweet that I got to see her and talk to her yesterday. Anything else before we start? All right.
Damage to their cars and houses.
Yeah, I pray for storm damage. I got that one on here. That's good. That's good. All right, let's pray. God our Father, here this morning we last night see the power of your creation. Um, we realize this was a terrible storm, but we read in your word about things much greater than this, and we see that nature is fearsomely made, both beast and plants and the ground underneath us. And we feel a little bit delicate before you sometime and before your creation. And we pray for any of those that were hurt or damaged or inconvenienced by the storm last night, that will be restored and recovered quickly. And God, we sometimes it helps us to see your hand. We don't wish for it, but in these things we see your hand, and also when we come through the other side of it, we feel protected. And God, we're grateful for that. So here this morning, please be with all that are in the body here at Crosstown, that they're safe, and if they need help, that we'll find out, and we can be your hands and your feet, and do something to make it better for them. And please be with our nation and our churches as we head into this week's voting, and help your will to be done. We know it always is, but also through us. And thankful for Tina being able to be here this weekend. And God, it was a blessing to share in the Chuck's funeral yesterday and see the beauty and joy that can happen at the end of life when we know that paradise lies ahead. Thank you for the gift that you give us in that. We do not fear death, and this life is sweet, but we know that we can close our eyes for the last time, and with peace and joy that wells up inside of us, because we'll soon be with you and your Son and your Spirit in paradise. God, help us as we look at your word this morning to see things that we need from it, and thank you for the richness of it, and we just wonder at it. And forgive us when we sin. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Sorry about that. Well, I was a little bit afraid because the power's out all around our house, but luckily it came on right before the donut shop. So Mikey's pretty happy out there. And it was very full. I guess everybody didn't have breakfast, and a lot of them were staying home from, I know the big church down the road was out. So there was a lot of families with little kids in there eating donuts. I'm glad we got some. But our names are eternal as well. And that's something I really hadn't considered. Our names are eternal. And, of course, they're in the book of life. And so the book of names, the book of life, I want mine in there. A good name is what we build with our heart and mind and soul and strength. It starts sounding like that greatest command, doesn't it? Really loving God is how we get a good name. And so, I was in research for this class, I came all across a reference for a book, on Bible Gateway, a book by Lockyer, All the Men of the Bible. And it includes an alphabetical list of all the men in the Bible, and that's just the men, over 3,000 of them. That's a lot. Then I think I didn't have time to read the book, but there were some descriptions of it and a couple of paragraphs I thought were worthwhile to our class. And so I'll read a couple of excerpts from it if it doesn't put you to sleep this morning. He says, "The Bible is the most faithful book in the world. I challenge anyone to find another ancient or modern book about any topic that's as detailed and honest to its characters. This is not fiction. It tells the truth about God and angels and creation and a record of men and women from the beginning of time until today. It's stories of people and their names reconcile with all of recorded history about the secular world. We tend to magnify the good in our heroes, minimizing their faults. The Bible gives true testimony, light or dark, good or evil, are all shown without apology or excuse." We want to see a little bit of that in our lesson today. "It's a wonderful canvas, a tapestry of human life. Every aspect of human nature is exhibited in the portraits in the Bible name gallery. Nowhere in the world have we such an album of human life. This Bible is so severely taken for granted. If completely considered and confronted by the Bible, all mankind would kneel before the words of their Creator. What a crazy mix of character it presents. Here you'll find kings and common, rich and poor, tender-hearted and cruel, saints and sinners, courageous and cowardly. Here we have men and women with the same desires, weaknesses, and passions as ourselves. No wonder the Bible speaks of itself as a mirror. James 1, 2 Corinthians 3, and 1 Corinthians 13. As we look at the lives of its men, pure and profane, we see ourselves. The formidable assignment of alphabetically arranging all the males or men in the Bible appeared when it was discovered there were well over 3,000 specifically named. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Probably be a pretty interesting read. And then for this class's perspective, many of these male names were listed in genealogies to show lineage, and maybe little is recorded about them. Others are listed and God gives a comment about them with a brief exclamation. You know, so-and-so was a bad king because. And many of the men named are not good names. I kind of looked and I found about 33 really bad kings and maybe 9 good ones. That's disappointing, isn't it? You'd like for the balance to be the other way. A related topic, not in this book that I showed the picture of, are the names of women in the Bible. Roughly about 300 women are named in the Bible, only a tenth as many as the men. The difference in numbers of names, 3,000 versus 300, does not imply any difference in importance to God. We all know that most of life gets done by women in families and in the church. Men and women, just different roles. In the Bible, men are supposed to lead. Look at God's example and instruction on this in the content of leading nations and tribes and families and churches. And that's a lot of the reason there were so many male names. Consider in your mind as examples roll through your head. What are some good names that pop up to you, male names that pop up to your head in the room? What are some good ones that just pop into your head? David? Yep. I'll put a check mark by that one. I had a list too. Abraham had a list, you bet. Moses, you bet. Those are 3 big ones. Judah, I didn't have that one, but you bet. Elijah. Elisha. We're starting to sound like a grade school Bible classes here. This is the good stuff. Kids ought to be hearing this. Who else? Paul. Jesus. Yep, he counts. He counts God and man. You bet. I'd even put Adam in there. There was some, I don't know what it would be like to start from nothing and just make the world, I don't know, Adam. But yeah, John the Baptist, the list goes on. In the Bible, women really are the fabric of life. If you look at the Bible, it portrays them as the life givers, the nurturers, often the wise counselor for the knot-headed man who's about to do something really stupid. We looked at Abigail earlier. She tried to fix the situation with Nabal, her husband, his name literally means fool, and she gives him a chance, and he still doesn't do it and ends up dead, and she goes off and marries David. And so, the good decisions of a man often come at the counsel of a good woman. Anybody in the room experienced that? I have. Neither male nor female are more important than either, just different roles. Maybe a good topic for a quarter of study. Anybody ever had a whole quarter on lessons on the roles of men and women in the church? Is that a hot button issue today? It's so hot I don't even put my finger on it I probably burn the tip of my finger. I just, maybe I better lick it first, Anybody ever done that? Skillet, lick it, touch it, see if it's hot enough. So anyway, there are fewer female names in the Bible. Certainly we come up with 10 or 12 bad ones, right? There's, as we talked about earlier this quarter, anybody ever seen their little baby Jezebel lately? No. I'm not going to do that. But some good ones that pop up, just like we did on the males. What are some good ones that pop up for you? I said Adam. I would argue Eve, even though the sin was there. I would argue Eve. Ruth, you bet. I'll check that one. Sarah, I'll check that one. Naomi, I didn't have that one down, but I'll put it in here. Esther, got to check that one. Rahab, you bet. She's in the Hall of Fame. You bet I had that one. Anybody else? Mary, had Mary. All the Marys. Hannah. How about Deborah? She stepped up. We were talking about roles of men and women. She kind of stepped up and get the job done when there wasn't anybody else who was going to get it done. You bet. Rebecca, Martha, Hagar, Jochebed, Lydia. The list goes on. And every time you say one of those names, I say the male names, I think, yep, they did a good job of leadership. When you say the women's names, you just get this warm feeling because it's sort of deeper and more personal and sweeter somehow. I think that's true of men and women in general. But the Bible is honest, and it portrays both men and women in good and evil tied to their name. There are examples of evil women that use their influence on their men for bad, and many more examples of good women with good names. The Old Testament has one perspective, but the perspective brought by Christ on women in the church was revolutionary. He elevated women, and God tells through the New Testament a story of the richness and spiritual power of women beyond any book of the time and really beyond almost all societies from then until now. And those names are what you remember. The name reminds you of everything that they were. So I thought that was kind of a good thing to stop and think about. God came into the world through Mary, and then I think I'm going to take time to do it, to read real quickly. Just because I love this. I read it to my mama when she was dying. She wanted somebody with her, and she wanted me to read from the Bible, so I read Proverbs 31. Isn't it sweet? Probably the last thing that she ever heard from me was these words from God. And I'm going to go ahead and read from the beginning. Proverbs 31, if you haven't read it lately, is interesting. The first 9 verses are different. And this is the last of the Proverbs. This is of all that book and all those this and then that, good sayings. Proverbs 31 is the last thing God ends on. Isn't that interesting? And the last thing he ends on is talking about a good woman, a good wife. Verse 1 through 9 is kind of interesting, though. I kind of skip over that, and it kind of a little bit of a reminder in this world, this day, another hot button issue, believe it or not, really in the church is alcohol. And Proverbs 31, verse 1, the sayings of King Lemuel, an oracle his mother taught him. To catch that? His mother taught him. O my son, O son of my womb, O son of my vows, do not spend your strength on women, your vigor on those who ruin kings. Okay, that's a whole nother discussion. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, not for kings to drink wine, not for rulers to crave beer, lest they drink and forget what the law decrees and deprive all the oppressed of their rights. Give beer to those who are perishing, wine to those who are in anguish. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of those who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. I think we've skipped over that part of that chapter quite often. Let's get into the last part. Verse 10, a wife of noble character, who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. She is like the merchant ships, bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it's still dark. She provides food for her family and portions for her servant girls. She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. She sees that her trade is profitable, and her lamp does not go out at night. In her hand, she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. When it snows, she has no fear for her household, for all of them are clothed in scarlet. She makes coverings for her bed. She is clothed in fine linen and purple. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them and supplies the merchants with sashes. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children arise and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the reward she has earned. Let her works bring her praise at the city gate. Wow. Is that about as beautiful as words get in the Bible? And these, portions of this you can see in every woman. Portions. And it doesn't matter whether she's married or not. All these things apply. And so, as we talk about good names, and I talked about these roles, and the 3,000 named men and only 300 named women, you read this, and it's clear who God values. It's clear to me. I just had to read that, sorry. But you see her heart, you see her attitude, and that can be applied to many examples and actions of society through time and even to today, and it's tied to the names, the rich biography of human names that we have in the Bible. So let's move on. I believe that there is a life lesson in each of those names. We talked about the 3,000 men, the 300 women. I believe there's a life lesson in each one of those names for stories told about them. Life lessons that have power if taught to children. We were kind of getting at that just a minute ago. Elijah, Elisha, those Bible stories going on in this building this morning where names are told. And as they grow, there's power for those children in those names. And the choice, they see their lessons about God's goodwill and the choices that people have for it. Life lessons for the consequences of how they choose. I don't know about you, but there have been times in my life when I was tempted to sin, and a name from the Bible saved me. A name from the Bible saved me. A name or a character and a situation, and I thought, I need to be like that instead of like Roddy right now. And so, and you see the consequences for how they choose. It's kind of nice to know in advance. You can choose. You can go down this road. You can go down that road. Wouldn't it be nice, if you could? Don't we all wish we had a map sometimes when we're heading home from work to know whether there's a wreck ahead on that one? I'll just take 75 instead, and I'll get home on time. And of course, we have some apps on our phones that can do that these days and that kind of thing. But really, that's what the Bible is. It's kind of like it tells you, you go down this road and it's good, and you go down that road, not so good. You don't want to end up like that. And so I think these names can save us from choosing poorly from their choices, good and bad. And let's look at it's time to move in these last lessons of this quarter into some of these examples. This is kind of a crazy one. Do you think this is maybe an unlikely name? Would any of you, if I said, give me a good name out of those 3,000 men, would you have come up with Mephibosheth? I'm going to bet $1 that nobody would have said that one, me included. But he's a character in the Old Testament Bible. His story's told in 2 Samuel. What does this name mean to you in the room? Last one to die before the flood? I didn't even remember that. I don't think so. This is a different guy. What now? David's grandson, close, very close, but David definitely had something to do with it. Saul's grandson. Good job from the back row. Ding, ding. You get a gold star. But yeah, exactly. Mephibosheth, he's not mentioned, but just like one little, and it's kind of a fun thing for kids to say. I'd love to hear a room full of 2-year-olds saying Mephibosheth. You probably end up with some spit on you. But he was the disabled guy. He was lame in both feet after probably being dropped by his nurse when she fled in panic after the deaths of his father was Jonathan. His grandfather was Saul, son of Jonathan, grandson of King Saul. But born into royalty, but in this day and time, you weren't much good if you were disabled. It was not a kind world. No wheelchairs. I guess the wheel had been invented, but that's about, nobody had made it into a wheelchair. And David seeks to honor someone of King Saul's family right after Jonathan and Saul are killed, right? And so, in this moment, David restores Saul's inheritance to Mephibosheth, tells him he can live in his palace in Jerusalem and invite him to eat his table. And interestingly, he had a son named Micah, not Micah the prophet. But, 12 years earlier, Saul battling, before his death, he died fighting the Philistines, right? 12 years before, he was fighting them before. And he impatiently offered sacrifices to God. He was supposed to wait for Samuel to come offer the sacrifices before they go to battle, right? Is it just anybody supposed to do that? Is just anybody in the Old Testament times supposed to offer sacrifices? The priests, right? Yep. He gets impatient, and if you read the text, he was saying, well, you told me it'd be this many days. Well, he didn't wait till the end of the day. He didn't wait on God. A lesson in that, waiting on God in our lives to do His will. He didn't wait on God. He didn't wait on Samuel. So he gets out there and starts messing around in somebody else's kitchen. He's slaughtering the animals and doing all that, but he's not doing it right, and he's not the right guy to do it. And Samuel walks up and says, "What are you doing? Because of this, it will be the end of you." Saul was only 30 at the time he was in this battle, jumping ahead and doing priestly stuff. And then when he died, he was only 42. So Samuel steps up and says, "You don't realize what you've done. You can make lots of mistakes in life, but you don't mess up on how you worship God. He's got very specific instructions on how He wants to be worshiped, and you just busted them to pieces, and you're going to die, and David's going to take your throne." But then he ends up dying. And we remember Jonathan and Saul died in battle in Philistine on the Mount Gilboa. You remember the scene? Saul gets wounded, right, by archers. And instead of letting God's will be done, instead of continuing into the fight, whatever he needs to do, what does he do? He falls on his sword. That's a whole nother discussion about, suicide. And in his last act, he didn't trust God's will, whatever that was going to be with those arrows. Yeah, Samuel told him he was going to die, so maybe this was it, maybe it wasn't. It could have been that if he'd have marched forward and asked for God's forgiveness and said, "God, all the glory goes to you," it may be that he wouldn't have died in this battle, or God could have changed his mind. He does that, rarely. But he dies, he falls on a sword. But what does Jonathan do? He throws himself into the battle, even though he knows it looks like all is lost, and he dies. So in this terrible moment, David really had what kind of feelings for Jonathan? Good ones. That's his buddy. That's his best friend. They loved each other. And Saul, even though Saul had persecuted him, remember the cave scene where David was in there and Saul goes to it's one of the silliest, craziest stories in the Bible. He goes in the cave to go to the bathroom, and the Bible tells you that. And David does what? He could have killed him in that moment. David was not unarmed, and Saul was vulnerable. Could have easily killed him, but he didn't. But something told him if he just snipped off a piece of the robe, that'd be useful later on. And of course, you know that story. But David had respect for God's anointed. Saul was God's anointed. David had a respect for that. And he didn't mess with that. He didn't take it into his hand. He let it be at God's hand. So in this story, there's all kinds of names being pulled in. And each name drags a story. Jonathan, the friend that Jonathan was. Saul, the messed up anointed that he was. David, good and true in so many ways, but wow, is he messed up in others. And then this sort of forgotten little piece, this forgotten little name of Mephibosheth. In 2 Samuel 9 starts, David asks, after Jonathan and Saul are dead, and David is made king, David asks, is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of John's household called Ziba. They called him to appear before David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? Your servant, he replied. The king asked, is there no one left in the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He's crippled in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. Ziba answered, he's at the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lo-debar. So King David had him brought from Lo-debar to the house of Machir, son of Amiel. And when Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth, your servant, he replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him. For I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Wow. Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. Everything's everything. This was the king. He gave him everything. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him to bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And he had a young son named Micah. All the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table, and he was crippled in both feet. I see this story, and this name, this kind of crazy name that I even stumble on, and a young child with learning how to use their tongue and say their S's and R's and W's, Mephibosheth, It resonates through history for me. This line in this whole passage for me, what is your servant that you would notice a dead dog like me? Does that hit you? What do you think about that? Is that right? Is that wrong? Is that good? Is that bad for Mephibosheth to say something like that? The family was killed. He was just scraps left over. He could easily have been wiped off the table like a crumb. And should have been in those days, but you were saying what now? Yeah, I mean, he definitely was somewhere else. He wasn't coming over to David, popping his head up saying, oh yeah, by the way, I'm a grandson. What do you think you're going to do with me? So, yeah, so in that moment, what is your servant? I got to read those, well, I've turned the page, but that you should notice a dead dog like me. That was as low as you could call somebody in those days. Typically, the family is wiped out so that the kingship is pure. Yep. He's at the mercy. He's crippled. And Jonathan's name meant something forever. And David was putting a stake in the ground, saying, this name, I don't want to be forgotten. And to some extent, even Saul's, good and bad, I believe that in that moment, David was honoring the anointing of Saul by God and saying, this lineage, as you said, in those days, relatives of the king, they were tied to his train. If his train goes off a cliff into a ravine, they're all going with him. And yeah. It wasn't just, well, I'll make sure you have food, I'll make sure you have a place like, no, it's yours. Yeah, Brandon makes a point. He didn't just give Mephibosheth a name tag. I'm Mephibosheth. Yeah, give him a set of clothes, maybe. No, he gave him everything that Saul had owned. That everything. That word in there is kind of a big deal. The generosity of David in relation to this name. This name didn't mean anything to David. Didn't mean a thing. And then he goes further. He says, okay, I'm taking care of Mephibosheth, giving you all that, but oh, by the way, I'm going to take care of your son, your family too. That is taking care of your whole family. So, in this moment of David and Mephibosheth, David made a big sacrifice. He gave everything that Saul owned. He comes into kingship and he gives everything that Saul owned. That's a whole lot of whatever the kingdom is, I'm just saying. And so, a forgiveness in this moment. Mephibosheth, he didn't even know his name. He just said, I got to honor the name of Jonathan. I can't let his name get forgotten. And I'm willing to sacrifice a lot to make that happen. And then the recipient of that sacrifice isn't belligerent, isn't saying, well, I want to get it my way. By the way, since you said that, can you get that in writing? And oh yeah, I'd sure like that Rolls Royce that he used to drive. Is that included? He didn't have attitude about the situation. He says, what? What are you? What am I that you would notice a dead dog like me? And in this moment, I kind of see the demonstration of love towards a man who did not deserve it, and could never earn it and never would be able to repay it. And what does that start sounding like? Starts sounding like Christ, like God's sacrifice of Christ. And, you know, we sing that song. I remember stepping out in the aisle. You probably heard me tell this before. When I was in late high school, that song, Just As I Am, that's the one I stepped out in the aisle and made the decision to go get under that water to. Isn't that really what Mephibosheth's saying here? Just as I am, you're going to do this for me. And so, as we look at these 3,000 Bible names, this one kind of came to mind through a little reading, and it teaches me today to be in this name, this story, teaches me to be like David, to be aware, look for the lost and hopeless, the needy. Remember where you've been. David had been lost and hungry and homeless. See the faithfulness and fidelity of David for Jonathan, even after Jonathan was gone. See the respect for God that David extended to Saul's memory, the anointed one, the anointed king. He saw in that moment, even though Saul tried to kill me, he was God's choice for one, good or bad. He respected that. There's all kinds of stories in the name Mephibosheth. And it teaches me today to be like Mephibosheth, to be humble. I hear those words in verse 8, to see my vulnerability, to see my weakness, my crippled nature before God, my helplessness to save myself, to protect myself, and to be humble before my God, and grateful to accept His grace. He didn't keep refusing, right? He didn't keep refusing. He accepted it. And that's hard. Y'all in the room got trouble with accepting God's grace? Your pride says, I can do this. I can be good enough. I don't need the sacrifice for my sin. Not really. I've been going to church long enough where I'm good enough. And in this moment, in this story of Mephibosheth, I see my dead dogness before God. So both the names David and Mephibosheth, they mean more to me from this story. These names guide me through their example. Good names. Good names. So, another name. Anybody remember this one? Have you ever used your phone? Your phone, you can put in how to pronounce this Bible name, and some guy over in the Middle East, he has sort of a Middle Eastern accent. He says, let me tell you how to pronounce this name today. It is Itai. Itai. Like not e-giving or e-commerce, but Itai. Anybody remember him? Any hands go up? Not me, sorry. I didn't know who Itai was. But as I was sort of in 2 Samuel, he's a character in the Bible that appears in multiple passages, including right in this area, 2 Samuel 15, 2 Samuel 18, 2 Samuel 23. And in 2 Samuel 15, David's son Absalom was plotting rebellion against David. Remember, Absalom was making friends and making alliances, getting ready to hold a coup, rebellion. David, it was in a time in his life, later in his life, what happened to Solomon later in his life? Super wise, super good, all that stuff. Didn't he kind of start messing up? He got all full of his wealth and all this stuff, and he saw his life started falling apart, his relationships started falling apart, and maybe that's why he wrote that beautiful book, Ecclesiastes. He's talking about, let me tell you what really matters in life. Are some of us older folks in that mode right now? We've lived enough, we've made enough mistakes that if you could get a young person aside and they really would stop and listen, you could say, I'm a mess, and let me tell you how I messed up so maybe you won't do it. And towards the end, David was messing up quite a bit. It wasn't just with Bathsheba, right? Was that the only thing he ever messed up? Nope. So he's weak in this moment. His own son, Absalom, probably David was focused too much on life and didn't spend time raising this kid like he should have. Anybody feel like that in the room sometimes? And Absalom, his son, is making alliances. David has suffered from indecisiveness and weakness of leadership in his family and his nation. And so David hears about Absalom getting ready to take over, and what does he do? He grabs some of his people, some of his things, and he takes off to run and escape. I'm going to read some of 2 Samuel 15. See if I can turn to it here. All right. I'll start in about 13. 2 Samuel 15, 13. A messenger came and told David, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. So he's been successful. The revolution's about to occur. Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword. Does that sound like David, the strong leader? David who trusts God. The king's officials answered him, your servants are ready to do whatever the Lord, our king, chooses. The king set out with his entire household following, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. That's odd. So the king set out with all the people following him. They halted at a place some distance away, and all his men marched past him, along with all the Kerethites and the Pelethites and all of the 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath, marched before the king. Kind of weird. There's a whole bunch of Ittites, not Israelites. The city was full of other folks. The king said to Ittai, the Gittite, why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom. You are a foreigner, an exile from your homeland. You came only yesterday, and today shall I make you wander about with us when I don't even know where I'm going? Go back, take your countrymen. May kindness and faithfulness be with you. But Ittai replied to the king, as surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be. Who does that sound like? Yeah. This is a Ruth didn't invent this. This must be sort of a thing you said in that day to show your total allegiance. According to God, before you, life or death, I'm yours. Wow. Those are some powerful words. I think, we hear, when we think of the word Ruth, don't those words echo in our head? When she's speaking to Naomi. He says, so David said to Ittai, go ahead, march on. So Ittai the Gittite marched on with all his men and all the families that were with him. Ittai wasn't just saying this for himself, was it? What else was on the line? Everybody. His family and all the families that he was responsible for. This guy was of some importance. There were, 600 of them? So they're all in because of the leadership of Ittai. Not just his personal commitment, but what God asks a man to do, and that is go with God and go with his king. How did David even know the Gittites? Well, he had spent time in Gath, where the Gittites were from. But do you see a little bit of a role reversal here? just a few chapters before, we're talking about David extending grace to Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth saying, I'm just a dead dog. Why are you honoring me with this? Do you see this role reversal here? In the verses afterwards, it says, David said to Ittai, march on, and it says in verse 23, the whole countryside wept aloud as the people passed by. Why do you think that was? Why were all the people crying when they saw David running with his tail between his legs? Yeah, they saw him leaving the homeland. What are they thinking? A little bit about themselves, probably in that moment. If their beloved David is running out the back door with some of his stuff and a few of his people, they're thinking, they didn't have Facebook or CNN or whatever. They're thinking, well, something must be going on in Jerusalem, and I think it's not good. And the king, the leader, God's chosen, is running out the back door, and a whole bunch of foreigners are going with him. People were just weeping, probably for themselves, but also for David, I think. And the will of God. Don't we see sometimes when nations or churches turn away from God's will that it wounds us?
Well, especially if that, you look at David, how powerful he was, and how man he was, man after God's own heart. Here they're running away, and who knows if they knew about the whole Absalom thing or not, and they did it, maybe they didn't, but if they did, then they're thinking, Absalom's not a good guy.
Yeah. He's a bum.
He was completely off to David, but
Yeah.
I think they're weeping. Maybe they're thinking, this great man of God, David, followed God, trusted God. He's kind of given up on God and saying, "Hey, look, I don't." And now they're going to be under control of a man who was supposed to sing from.
They're weeping, over the failure of God's will in their nation. Yeah. So I see a little bit of a reversal of roles. And in this moment when David is weak and vulnerable, crippled, somebody offers him, Ittai and his 600 says, nope, we're with you. We're all in. And David tries to talk him out of it. He says, nope, we're in. And I see him accepting the grace from someone. And I think this is a big problem with me personally and in the church, is fully accepting the grace of God. I think that weakens us. And it's probably deeper and more prevalent than we all want to admit. And if we fully accept that grace, there's power in that. But Ittai is mentioned multiple times, and we're kind of running out. I love this. As surely as the Lord lives, and as my Lord, the King, lives, wherever my Lord, the King, may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be. Can you say more than that? I don't think you can put anything else on there. It's just extra. And I see in Ittai, in this name, what I want to say for my God. The way I want to live every day. Wouldn't it be great to wake up every morning and say this to God? David feel. Oh my gosh, this guy, he just, I think it just been a few days. He just showed up with all these people, and maybe he didn't know everything was going on. Maybe God sent him. I trust that God does that kind of thing. We'll finish out with Ittai. He was a commander in David's army during Absalom's revolt. A foreigner who had recently arrived in Judah, his loyalty to David was remarkable. A Gittite. He was from the Philistine city of Gath, and David had spent time there when he was running from Saul. The son of Ribai from Gibeah, and Benjamin, who was one of David's mighty men. Anybody heard the term mighty men? the Benjamites were a tribe of Israelites descended from Benjamin, the youngest son of Jacob and Rachel, mighty men. What a term. And then we see in the story, as they're running, Absalom comes after him. Remember what happens to Absalom? We're about out of time. What happens to Absalom when he's chasing them down? He gets his hair, the Hebrews it's almost comical. It's like, I don't know, some kind of Western where, pulled him off his horse. He's riding through the woods. And of course, in this battle, it's interesting that in this battle, it says that 20,000 Israelites fell at the hand of these very few. David and his very few, this mighty man and his very few. 20,000 people died. I'm guessing is mostly Israelites. And it said more were claimed by the forest than the sword. What happened to Absalom? He was claimed by the forest. He's riding through the woods after him thinking, we got him on the run. It's like Pharaoh. We've got him on the run. Let's run him down and kill them all. And his hair or his head gets hung in this tree, and his horse rides off from underneath him. And undoubtedly, he's hanging there for a long time. He can't get loose. The tree's got him. I'm starting to see the hand of God in this situation, especially when it says the forest claimed more than the sword. But he's hanging there, and as David, in this route, David is saying, don't kill him. He's my son. Treat him well. I kind of want him back. Is that really wise? Is that sort of fit God's plan? When somebody revolts like that, there needs to be consequences. I don't know. That's a whole other discussion. We're not going to be able to answer that. But these commanders, Ittai, Joab, and one other, I've forgotten the name, they go after, and they go out there, and they hear that Absalom's hanging from this tree by his hair, and he's hanging there, and what did David say? Cut him down, bring him back to me. Well, Joab throws 3 spears through his heart, and then he tells his men to finish him off, and they chop him in pieces, and then they throw him in a pit and cover him with rocks. But boy, in this story, we see this beauty, David, Mephibosheth, Jonathan. We see this story about Ittai. I want to be Ittai. What man doesn't want to be one of the mighty men who pledges allegiance and does great things, and he goes on to do great things. And then there's Joab. And wow, did Joab do some bad stuff. I have a list here. We see the carnality of Joab in 2 Samuel 3:27. He tricked and gut-stabbed Abner under a white flag of truce. David had been talking to him. David walked away, and he goes up and gets close to him and gut-stabs him and kills him. David knew this, and he still let Joab hang around. I'm just saying he wasn't perfect. Joab is the one who withdrew from Uriah so David could have Uriah's wife Bathsheba. Second thing he did bad. Joab cunningly talked David out of punishing Absalom for murdering Tamar over the rape of Tamar's sister. Joab directly disobeyed his command that we just read about. Joab was demoted below Amasa, but once again, he walks up to Amasa to give him a kiss of peace. It literally says, give him a kiss of peace. He grabs his beard and he gut stabs him and he kills him. Oh my gosh. And then Joab, as David was on his deathbed, was making alliances with his son Adonijah. And that doesn't end up well for him. So at the end, David pulls Solomon up. David's dying, and he pulling his son Solomon up and says, I've been kind of a mess. I shouldn't have kept Joab around. He did lots of bad stuff, and I let him stay around. You see the weakness of David in that moment, but he tells Solomon, you need to kill him before he does more evil. So Solomon kills him, and kills Adonijah, and then takes care of Joab. Joab runs in and he grabs the horns of the tabernacle sacrifice spot, and they chop him in pieces right there hanging on the horns. But these stories, I run out of time. I want to be a mighty man. You want to be a mighty woman for God, and we'll move on in the next lesson. But again, next week, probably be going in 123. Thank you.